Welcome to another edition of Confidently Speaking with DOC. I am your host, David Doc Shirey, author of the book, Rare Confidence, Strategies and Inspiration to Strengthen Your Belief that you can achieve anything. Episode number 26 on tap tonight, and we are talking COVID and the impact that it's had on the hospitality industry. Restaurants and hotels are absolutely getting crushed right now. And we are very honored to have the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Restaurant and Lodging Association, John Longstreet, with us tonight. But before I introduce John, just a reminder that this is a participatory program, so be sure to comment and ask questions, and we'll try to get many of those on the air tonight as possible. And if you could share the video, that would be awesome, because that would help to expand the show's reach. So without any further ado, let's meet John Longstreet. John Longstreet is president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Restaurant and Lodging Association. The PRLA represents Pennsylvania's 25,000 restaurants and 1,400 hotels by promoting, protecting, and improving the hospitality industry in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and beyond. With nearly 3,000 members, the PRLA is among the largest hospitality associations in the United States. Prior to taking the helm of the PRLA, Longstreet was president and CEO of Quaker Steak and Lube. During his tenure, the company posted record growth, expanding from 38 to 65 restaurants in 17 states and Canada. Prior to Quaker Steak and Lube, Longstreet was executive vice president of Club Corp USA, which operates 160 golf and business clubs around the country. He has also served as senior VP at Bristol Hotels and Resorts and was vice president of Intercontinental Hotels. Longstreet served 2 terms as mayor of Plano, Texas, a city of more than 250,000. During his tenure, Plano was ranked the 5th fastest growing and among the safest cities in the country. More than 50 new companies moved to Plano during Longstreet's 2 terms in office. Married to Brenda, John is a Cornell University graduate, as are his 2 children, John and Liz. John Longstreet, welcome to the program.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Doc. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on, John. You know, we're 7 months into this pandemic, and we all love to eat and travel, and the industry that you represent certainly has been affected as much, if not more, than any industry there's been, really, John. And I guess before we get into any topics of the day, I wanted to maybe ask you if you can share with us exactly what the Pennsylvania Restaurant and Lodging Association is all about.
I'd be happy to. And you mentioned that we represent both hotels and restaurants in the state. We also represent travel and tourism. We're one of 6 associations in of all the states that represent the entirety of the industry. So, for example, your Visit Pittsburgh is a member of ours as well, and we work for them. And you described us as protecting, promoting, and improving the industry. We like to think that we provide the advocacy so that the industry can sustain, the knowledge so it can grow, and the resources so it can thrive. And I will say that since the pandemic hit, we've totally shifted, and we shifted very quickly the focus of PRLA. And now our mission is entirely different. Mostly it is providing information and trying to get resources to restaurants and hotels and destination marketing organizations. And then most importantly, getting them safely reopened, because we all know that there's not enough money in the state to save the industry if we can't get them back in business. So we've shifted a lot, we've pivoted a lot, and it's been very interesting what's happened since March 18th when the closure hit.
I would imagine that if I was a restaurateur, that your organization is one I would absolutely want to be really close to right about now.
Well, you know, all the restaurants are, and I'll tell you why. We recognized very early on actually the very first order on March 18th had some confusion, a lot of confusion around it. One of the things that happened is hotels were closed, which never should have happened. And we very quickly rallied, got with the governor's office, and we think this is a mistake. You don't really want to close hotels because hotels are essential businesses. There's thousands of guests who will be out on the street. That was our first exposure with a long list of confusing information that came out throughout the months. So what we did is we recognized that the first thing that the industry needed was information, and correct, accurate information. We started publishing a daily update online rather than a weekly one, 7 days a week. And we opened the association up to every restaurant and hotel and travel entity in the state without regard to dues. We suspended the collection of all dues, recognizing that the last thing that anybody could do that time is pay out any money that they didn't need to. We needed to preserve their cash flow. So we essentially brought every restaurant in the state aboard so we could help them with information flow, resources, getting money to their laid off employees through unemployment, expediting unemployment for them, trying to find financial resources for the restaurants to get them through, and most importantly, getting them the ability to convert to tableside or to curbside, to go business, and then eventually convincing the governor to let them have outdoor dining during the yellow phase. Many, many other things have happened since March 18th, but we can get to those as we chat.
Yeah, we're going to definitely get into some of that. I want to ask you a question about the industry nationally, John. I know that prior to the pandemic, the national restaurant industry was projected to do almost $900 billion in sales in 2020. That figure has now been updated to reflect a $240 billion shortfall. And the National Association is also projecting that 75% of the nation's restaurants won't be able to turn a profit in the next 6 months. So I'm going to ask you about PA specifically in a couple minutes, but nationally, John, how does the industry as a whole weather this storm?
Well, it's a struggle. We've been trying to get some federal relief bills. The COVID-4 package has built into it, and as you know, that's stalled in Washington right now. That has a grant program for restaurants called Restaurants Act that would help restaurants make up some of the shortfall that they're facing this year versus last year. But the reality of it is what you touched on earlier, Doc, is that many restaurants aren't going to survive. And unfortunately, it's going to be those mom and pop independent restaurants that we love so much, that have so much to do with the fabric of our community. Look at Pittsburgh. It's become one of the great restaurant towns in the country now. And the restaurants arguably have helped to bring downtown Pittsburgh and neighborhoods in Pittsburgh back from decline. And unfortunately, those restaurants are going to go by the wayside. I'll give you a little bit more information on that study specifically about Pennsylvania when you're ready. But I should point out the National Restaurant Association is our partner in Washington. We partner both with them. We partner with the American Hotel and Lodging Association and the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. So we have a wealth of resources to try to get to the restaurants and hotels in the state.
So you referenced the government, John. What incentives did the federal government create for restaurants to keep people employed versus furloughing them? And what is their obligations to bring those workers back? How has that worked up till now?
Yeah. Well, conceptually, it was a good idea. And I will tell you, Doc, that the PPP, which is what you're talking about, the Paycheck Protection Program that came out in the third COVID package, was essentially formulated in 3 weeks. And the rules for it were written in a week. Typically, legislation like this would take 3 years, and it would take 6 months to write the rules. So there's no question there was going to be glitches with it. Plus, no one ever knew what to anticipate with this virus. When we say we're making it up as we go, that's no understatement. So what they anticipated was, well, if we can just get money to employers that they can pass through to their employees until June, then they'll be back up and running. Everybody will be back to work, and it'll be great. So I put together this Paycheck Protection Program, which actually worked fairly well. A lot of beneficiaries in the restaurant industry and all industries were able to get the money. 75% of it had to go to payroll. The rest of it could be spent on a combination of mortgage interest or rent and utilities. But so the vast majority of it flowed right through to employees. So many employees never went without a paycheck. Many weren't working because restaurants were fully closed, with the exception of takeout and delivery on March 18th. One of the first industries to close and arguably the last to open. But so it enabled a lot of employees to stay on the payroll. What we didn't anticipate, meaning the legislature, is that this wasn't going to end on June 30th. In fact, we don't know when it's going to end.
Right.
Restaurants, as you know, have been cut way back again in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has one of the most draconian regulations for restaurants in the country. So restaurants are struggling, and the PPP money is long gone. There was hopes that it would be replenished in COVID-4, and it may still happen. But as you have heard, the Congress and the president are not able to come to terms on getting anything done on that, at least right now.
So when I look at Pennsylvania, and if my figures are correct, John, Pennsylvania's restaurant industry employs about 550,000 people. It accounts for about $25 billion annually in sales. And it's estimated that if things don't change for the better, that an astounding 63% of Pennsylvania's restaurants may close permanently within 6 months. Are those figures that you've seen? And I guess the bigger question is, what would be and what is the human toll in all of this?
Yeah, human toll is the worst part of the whole situation. You can talk about the billions of dollars that we're going to lose, but people are losing real livelihoods. Restaurateurs are losing their restaurants, and they're losing their homes, oftentimes where they took second mortgages to secure the restaurants. Those numbers are not just estimates. Those are based on that same survey that you talked about that the National Restaurant Association did nationally and a state level. So it's way more than an estimate. And what that told us is that in Pennsylvania, when asked the question, will you still be in business 6 months from now if the economic climate doesn't change, which generally means government regulations? In Pennsylvania, the answer to that, 63% said, I will be out of business permanently within 6 months. Now, to contrast that, Doc, on a national level, asked the same question, 38% of the restaurants said they'll be out of business in 6 months. This is what contrasts the difference between Pennsylvania has the second most stringent mitigation efforts for restaurants in the entire United States. And by the way, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal today. They took the 3 states with the most stringent regulations on COVID, California, New York, and Pennsylvania, and they're all in double-digit unemployment, whereas the vast majority of the other states are improving dramatically over that. So it has a real human toll. If 63% of the restaurants close, that's 17,000 restaurants in the state, Doc. 17,000 restaurants. That's about 365,000 human beings that'll lose their jobs forever.
Now, John, I know you're not a politician, and I'm not asking you to be one, but the 3 states you mentioned all have Democratic governors. There's obviously politics behind it, but what is the politics behind draconian measures, to use your words?
Yeah. Well, I'm the eternal optimist, and throughout this, I always wanted to believe that in Pennsylvania, our governor and Secretary Levine are doing what they think is right to save lives. That would be obviously a high charge. What has to happen, though, and what other governors have recognized, is it has to be balanced with the economic toll. And for example, the decision that was made on July 15th to reduce restaurants from 50%, where they were operating safely with 6-foot distancing, social face masking, and a requirement that you be in a seat to be served either food or beverage, those requirements were already in place, which made sure there was no congregating. For some reason, they decided to reduce it to 25%. That was almost a nail in the coffin for the restaurant industry, which was just barely surviving at 50% with very safe CDC-recognized protocols. So I don't know that no one has been able to answer how that happened, why it happened. We worked with the governor's team on developing the green reopening standards, and we had what I would describe, and he has described, as a collaborative effort. Why the collaboration ended then, I don't understand. I've asked the question. They haven't been able to explain it. And it's unfortunately, there's been bad decision after bad decision that have nothing to do with safety. Restaurants are all about safety and are really hurting the industry. I can't imagine that anybody would play with the lives of Pennsylvanians for politics. So I can't answer that question.
All right, so sticking with the theme of Pennsylvania, I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, but restaurants can go to 50% if they self-certify. Can you tell us what that process is, John? And I've heard that some restaurants are choosing not to self-certify. Maybe you can share with us why that is also.
Yeah. This was an order that was announced on September 8th and went into play September 21st. And what it did is it allowed restaurants to move back to 50% from 25% capacity if they self-certified, as you described. What that required them to do is to register with the state and essentially sign a document saying that they would abide by all of the safety protocols, either CDC, FDA, or state protocols. I'd have to say that I was frankly a bit surprised at how angry the restaurant industry was when this came out. Probably the number one reason was because the restaurant industry has felt like it's been persecuted. It was the first closed, the last opened. It's been required to do things that no other retail establishments are required to do. And then all of us, and by the way, it's probably the safest retail business out there. They're already required to have a manager that's ServSafe certified on premises. They're required to follow all the, to have a food license, to have FDA licensing. There are so many requirements for restaurants, which are fine because that keeps our patrons safe. To all of a sudden say, okay, now you also have to certify if you want to try to get open at a barely sustainable level. 25% is not sustainable. 50% is barely sustainable for some restaurants. And then to add insult to injury, when the governor rolled it out, he commented that this was based on a model that was in place in the state of Connecticut. We're very familiar with the model in Connecticut because they used a lot of our information when they put it together, that the PRLA put together. We worked collaboratively with them. The difference is in Connecticut, all retail businesses must be certified if they want to be open at all. It wasn't something that discriminated against restaurants or singled out or targeted one industry. The governor's made no bones about the fact that they're targeting the restaurant industry. Secretary Levine said the same thing in a hearing at the House Labor and Industry and Health Joint Hearing Committee hearing that I was with her at last week. Again, if there was some explanation as to why 25% is safer than 50% when you already are doing social distancing and face masking, that would be one thing. There's been no information provided to us. We've requested it. Several news outlets have requested it. There's been no information required or provided. I think it's because it doesn't exist.
And, you know, John, from a guy who loves to eat out and have a cocktail or two while I'm doing it with my wife and some friends, it seems like some of the restrictions and some of the requirements, such as, you know, you have to order food, and at one point you couldn't order appetizers, it had to be a meal, and if your meal is done, you can't have a drink, and you can't have a drink with your food after 11 o'clock. These policies seem random to me, and I know it makes it harder on these businesses. Why would someone think that those measures help to stop the spread of COVID?
Well, let me talk about the meal with a drink. And it is a meal that's required, and it's still required. And all the things you described are true. It's not just appetizers. It's what's defined as a meal in the liquor code. I want to go back to the original standards that were put in place with the green phase, because this will help to explain this. There was a lot of components to it, a lot of things to keep guests safe and employees safe. But the three biggest and most important undoubtedly were social distancing, face masking, and no seat, no service. That's the anti-congregating rule. So if you go into a bar and there's no seats, you can't go into the bar. You have to leave, and you have to wait outside until there's a seat available. Same thing with the dining table, and you have to be socially distanced from the next party. The concept behind requiring someone to order a meal when they order a drink would seem to be designed to stop congregating, like if you're going to a bar and having a whole bunch of people standing around partying, which was already prohibited if it had been enforced. Unfortunately, there was a few cases, and probably less than a handful in Pittsburgh, that were highly publicized that you're familiar with, that where there were people that went to a bar in violation of the then existing rules. We're not social distancing, we're not face masking. And since that time, that's been what Secretary Levine, at least in the hearing I was in, has been hanging her hat on. Well, we have to stop that from going on. Again, had the original rules that were well thought out, well designed, and meticulously researched with health professionals across the country been enforced, we wouldn't be talking about any of this.
And I think, John, that the CDC kind of piled on too. If I'm not mistaken, the CDC said something to the effect of that, the spread of coronavirus, a lot of it can largely be pinned to restaurants. And then the National Restaurant Association, of which you partner with, vehemently disputed that claim as irresponsible and based on false assumptions for blaming the spread on a single industry. And to quote the National Restaurant Association, when restaurants demonstrate effective mitigation efforts, the risk is low, whether dining inside or outside. So it just makes you shake your head as to why this is happening.
Well, one of the problems with the CDC study is that the headline read different than the body of the study did. If you read the body of the study, it had its own disclaimer in there pointing out that what it did is it said that that folks that had contracted COVID, in addition to going many other places, also visited a restaurant. They also had a very small sample size at 10 states. I think it was like 200 surveys at 10 states, and with all different requirements. Some states require certain social distancing, some require face masking, some may not, and not a single restaurant in the study was in Pennsylvania. So for anyone in Pennsylvania to say, well, this is proof that there's a problem with restaurants, there is no evidence to that. Even the study itself, if you read it carefully, points that out. But this is the kind of thing that, for whatever reason, that makes good headlines. And I'm glad that people like you try to get to the truth of it. No BS, right?
No BS, man. No BS. That's what this show's all about, John. I know early on in Pennsylvania's reopening phase, for all businesses, it kind of went through this red, yellow, and green phase, and it was still somewhat arbitrary, but a lot of it was based upon numbers in each county. And I know that even in New York and some other states, they've taken a more localized approach based on outbreaks in specific areas or specific counties. It seems like now in Pennsylvania, it's just overly broad. It's all or nothing, the whole state or nothing. And like you and I chatted before the show, from Amish country to downtown Pittsburgh, you have very different types of populations, and it just seems so arbitrary to me.
There are a lot of counties in the state with less than 100 cases. And so it is hard to understand. And what I think is even more frustrating than that, Doc, is think of it this way. There have been so many reversals in course by the governor's office that no one knows what to expect next. I'm going to get to the reopening and then the closing. But for example, there was an order put out yesterday that theoretically broadened the amount of people that could attend events for an outdoor function and an indoor function. So many of our restaurants have bought tents so that they can do weddings outside. And now, with a tent that, as of yesterday, or as of today, because it starts tomorrow, an 80 by 110 foot tent could have had 250 people in it. The new rules that are supposedly allowing for expansion of outdoor events allow for 147 rules, 147 people through some convoluted formula that you almost have to have studied calculus to be able to figure out. So why we have to keep moving around, I don't understand. When we reopened, the governor and Secretary Levine said, we're going to open by county because each county is different. So we're going to be monitoring the cases and several other things in the counties. And that's how we're going to determine when we go from red to yellow and when we go to yellow to red or to green. So why wouldn't the same thing apply during reopening? I'm sorry, now when we've gone down back to 25% again. So we reopened that way, but we closed the whole thing at one time. And that's your point that you made. You're right. Most other states have done a more localized area, recognizing that there is a big difference between one part of the state and another part, particularly when you have a state as massive as Pennsylvania. If you're talking about a state like Connecticut, it might be a little different.
Right. And, you know, I paid very close attention yesterday when they came out with those new guidelines, being a Steelers season ticket holder, and we play the Eagles. So we got two Pennsylvania teams playing this Sunday, and, you know, Heinz Field holds 68,400 fans. They said either 11% or up to 7,500. Okay, 7,500 fans. Of course, then you take into account the teams, the personnel, the media, the families. That brings it down to 5,500 fans in a 68,400 seat venue. I mean, you literally would need a megaphone to talk to other people in that scenario.
Yeah, well, there's no question that the impetus behind this expansion was to try to deal with how upset everyone was with the fact they couldn't attend school sporting events, and particularly when the governor vetoed the legislation that would have allowed that. So this was clearly designed to try to appease that group. I'm not so sure whether it got there or not.
So when I think about cold weather coming, right? I know a lot of the mitigation efforts were outside, but we've got cold weather coming now. How is that going to even more impact what we're doing here?
Well, interestingly, up until yesterday, when the new dining, I should say, the gathering requirements were rolled out, restaurants and private event venues were scrambling to find tents and heaters because they figured they were going to have to be still eating outside throughout the winter. Now that's put into question, not only because of the fact that the size requirements for tents have changed, so have the standards for tents. Before it said that essentially a tent was a tent. Now they're saying that a tent should have two sides open on the tent at all times if they're having dining in it. Now, it doesn't say they must, it says they should. So I don't know how that's going to be interpreted, enforcement folks. But I had a restaurateur today who just bought a massive tent to do weddings in and just ordered all the sides for it, which of course he can't use now, according to the regulations, which changed last night.
Right. The rules keep changing. And, you know, I will say, in fairness to our leadership, you know, they're dealing with this the first time as well. And you know, I think Pennsylvania has done fairly well in terms of the overall numbers. Let me ask you a question, John, in terms of the type of dining. And this may be a ignorant question, but it seems to me, as somebody who's not in the industry, that fine dining is taking more of a hit right now than, let's say, fast food or fast casual. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. But if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on the point you just made, because I don't want it to be left unsaid. I agree with you that we should be proud of the numbers and the mitigation that's taken place in Pennsylvania. There's been a myriad of different things that have contributed to that. Our point is very simple. In the early days of the pandemic, when the governor thought it was important to have subject matter experts at the table to help to make decisions that were not only safe but sensible, and not only but also practical and allow businesses to survive, we came up with some really good, safe, sensible orders. Since they've essentially decided to do it on their own relative to restaurants, that hasn't been the case. So I agree with you that we should be happy that we've saved lives, but we're doing some things now that are not saving lives, and they're costing livelihoods, and in many cases lives in other ways. That's my only point. The fine dining restaurants are absolutely the hardest hit, and the least hardest hit, not surprised, are what we describe as quick serve. Some people call it fast food. They prefer to be called quick serve, because they were already equipped with drive-throughs. people were already accustomed to getting their food that way. You've probably noticed that most quick serve restaurants, you had a picture of McDonald's is a good example. Most of them are not even opening their dining rooms because that's an additional hassle for them to do that. So they only have drive-through. We stopped at one the other day, wanted to go in and use the restroom, couldn't even go in and use the restroom. So we had to go through drive-through, but couldn't drive through a restroom, obviously. Fine dining is the hardest hit because they require a full restaurant, and they can't have a full restaurant. They have very high expenses. A lot of them are located, like in Pittsburgh, in the downtown areas, and most of your office buildings are still closed downtown, and there's not a heavy residential there. So they're definitely struggling. Most of them were not able to also adapt to curbside service or delivery or takeout. Like the other section of the restaurant industry is casual dining. Those would be places like a PJ Wheelahan's or Red Robin or something like that. Those have adapted better because they quickly came up with delivery services. They quickly came up with curbside pickup. They brought packaging. They learned how to sell things to go. They created outdoor dining. A lot of things that a fine dining restaurant was just not able to do because of the configuration.
John, do you have any specific data on demographics of employees that are being negatively affected the most through all this?
Well, I don't have the demographics, but I can tell you that the restaurant industry is the largest employer of minority managers. So of all industries in the country, over 50% of the restaurants are owned by women. And not surprisingly, we have a huge diverse population that work in restaurants. The first group that was hardest hit in restaurants, not surprisingly, was servers, because there was no service. There was no inside dining. And that's usually, that's oftentimes moms or dads who require on the job a job that has has flexibility, because they might be a sole parent, or it might be a second income for them, or it might be a college student or a young person getting their first job. 1 in 3 people get their first job in a restaurant. It's kind of where you learn to work. So these folks are the ones that are going to be really hard hit. And particularly if as many restaurants close as is being predicted based on the surveys, these first jobs are going to go away. I don't know what young people are going to do then. So it's a real struggle for the industry in that regard. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, PPP money's gone now too. So those that were kept on the payroll are now on unemployment.
We have a question for you, John, from Jim Bennett. And Jim wants to know, is there discussion on certifying or vaccinating employees at restaurants and hotels so that somebody is certified that they've been vaccinated when available?
Yeah. I can't talk about vaccinations, not because I won't, because no one really knows how that's going to work. And as we know, when the vaccinations come out, they'll go to the first responders first, and folks like that, and the healthcare workers. I can tell you that there's already a certification program for managers and for employees in restaurants. Managers are required to be certified. It's called ServSafe. And they've added, in Pennsylvania, they're required to be certified. The same training is available in a shortened version for all employees. And we made that training available free to any restaurant in the state that wanted to train their employees on ServSafe with a COVID-19 package attached to it, so that they want to understand how to do safe service. I know that's not quite what the question is. It will be great when we can get rapid testing and we'll be able to test on a regular basis. And I know a lot of restaurant companies are looking into that so they can do it on a regular basis. The vaccine is there's so many questions about when that's going to come out, how many people are going to take it, how it's going to be administered. I'm not qualified to answer that one, I'm afraid.
John, I know that a lot of, maybe not a lot, but some chain restaurants have been unveiling some new designs that are inspired by the pandemic and looking toward the future, based mostly on added conveniences, more drive-ups, drive-through options, kind of order on your app and pick it up here. Can you shed any more light on this concept?
Yep. I think that restaurants that aren't looking at re-imaging themselves right now are going to have a problem when we move beyond this, because we're not going to go back to 100% full dining rooms this year. We're probably not going to go back next year. There's two things that cause restaurants to be swimming upstream, if you will. One is the government putting regulations in place that, in the case of Pennsylvania, aren't really adding to safety. And are causing them a lot of problems. And then the second is that there is consumer behavior too. Consumers are concerned in many cases about going out to eat. I think 40% of the nation said they're now comfortable going back to out to eat again, the highest number since it started, by the way. And that's for a dining in experience, but that's still 40%. So when people are comfortable coming back into the restaurant, maybe a while. The point is, those that have adopted new protocols in takeout, delivery, drive-throughs are going to need to keep those. And they need to figure out a way to keep those even when they're operating their dining rooms, because I don't think they're going to get back to 100%. So yeah, the new designs that you're talking about make all the sense in the world. And let's face it, without much time to do business, those companies that have the wherewithal, like the ones you showed, Taco Bell and Shake Shack, have the time now to spend on figuring out what they want to look like after the pandemic. People are still going to go out to eat. I get asked this question a lot from hospitality students who now are saying, am I in the wrong profession? I'm studying hospitality management at Penn State or Slippery Rock, and I don't know whether there's going to be a job. I believe people will always go out to eat, because the eating out is a lot more than good food. It creates memories, and you can't get memories just by going through drive-through.
We had a bit of a technical snafu there, John. I apologize. Vince Sacca has a question. He wants to know if you think that we're going to see car hops coming back in vogue anytime soon.
What a great question, Vince. My first job in this business was in an A&W restaurant. I was a short order cook there. And A&Ws back then were known for car hops, as you probably know. And I wouldn't be surprised. Sonic still does that, I believe, and that might make a lot of sense. People are very comfortable being outside now. And so, and of course, so that might be something that we'll see more of. It's a great idea.
John, what is your best advice to that business owner, that restaurant owner that's struggling right now to stay afloat? What would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I would do is tell them to take advantage of all of the resources that they can find, such as PPP if it comes around, and figure out a way to generate revenue in a way that they might not have thought of. Some restaurants have essentially created retail stores where they're selling food off the shelf like a grocery store. That's something that can be done. And a lot of the suppliers like Cisco or Reinhardt or US Foods are working with restaurants to help them set those things up. If you're not in takeout and delivery, get in takeout and delivery. You're going to need that business. You definitely need it now, and I think you're going to need it for the long run as well. Figure out a way to package your food and put together a menu that travels well so that you can maintain the same quality for takeout and delivery that you have internally. Look at all of your expenses and figure out a way to look at all the expenses that don't directly impact your guest, and look at trimming expenses, because it's unfortunately something that has to be done if we're gonna make it through. Go to your landlord. Look to your landlord for some relief. There's not going to be another restaurant tenant behind you that's going to come in and take that space if you go out of business, and you should make your landlord understand that and try to get that person to work with you.
That's tremendous advice. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in Pennsylvania, they instituted this cocktails to go program over the summer. And, are that many people actually calling ahead to order takeout cocktails to take them home and then to drink it? And it seems a little odd to me that the government would institute something like that. Kind of brings up some other issues of alcohol and driving.
It does. You'd be surprised, though, that this has been one more. And when I talk about find every way you can to generate revenue, this is an example. And frankly, this is something that PRLA promoted, and the legislature thankfully said we need to do everything we can to help the restaurants. And thankfully, Governor Wolf allowed it to become law. Now, it has to be a sealed container. The same rules apply when you have a cocktail in your car as did before. You can't drink it. You can only take it home and drink it. But it's amazing the amount of people that want to go get a margarita to take home with them. And so it's been one more little thing that's helping the restaurant industry. And interestingly enough, Doc, a lot of my counterparts around the country are now working with their legislatures to make that, and they've passed the same kind of legislation to make it permanent because it's become such a big deal for restaurants. I'm an absolute believer in you don't drink and drive. And I think the work that Matt has done in educating the public in that has been really good. So we're absolutely not encouraging people to either drink and drive or absolutely drink while they're driving. But that's why it has to be in a sealed container. It's pretty stringent rules behind it, but it has been a little bit of a lifeline for restaurants.
And I appreciate that as a business guy. Believe me, any new sources of revenue or income in a time like this. Let's turn our attention for a minute or two, John, to the hotel industry. Now, I know that back in March, I think Marriott was the first major hotel corporation that started furloughing employees, and then property started to shut down. Most other major chains followed shortly thereafter. Where does the hotel industry stand right now, 7 months into this?
Yeah, it's tough. It's not quite as tough as restaurants, but it's very close. And let me also explain one thing going into it. Most hotels are not owned by the company whose name is on the hotel. Most hotels are owned by an independent business person, and oftentimes somebody in your community, and they just franchise with Marriott or whatever the other name is to provide marketing services for them, brand standards, and a reservation network. So the amount of hotels that Marriott actually owns is you'd be surprised how few they are compared to the ones that are owned by people in the community or other small business people. So you think, well, that's a big company, they'll be able to withstand the storm. It's not necessarily the case. So it's a tough time for hotels. I don't have the exact numbers on how many hotels have closed, but I looked at a report around for Pennsylvania not too long ago. I was surprised at the number of hotels that were listed as closed. It was probably 10 or 15% when I went through the list. There's about 1,500 hotels in the state, as you correctly pointed out earlier. I wouldn't be surprised if we lose a third of those. And these are not the ones that are owned by the big companies. May have big company names, but they're owned by people right in your community. The ones that are, and I will say Pennsylvania, and we predicted this early on in the pandemic, is going to be one of the states where hotels come back a little bit quicker, and I'll tell you why. There's two segments to the hotel business. There's leisure travel, which is typically your vacationers, and then there's corporate travel, which is business travel. Believe it or not, the business in hotels nationwide is about 50% corporate. People a lot of times think, well, hotels where you stay on vacation. The vast majority of it's corporate. Corporate business is going to take a while to come back. After the tragedy of September 11th, it took 18 months for corporate business to come back. And they're now predicting that this is going to be 9 times worse than it was September 11th, 2001. I was in the hotel business then, and the bottom dropped out when that tragedy befell us. And I couldn't imagine what business was going to be like moving forward. It did come back, but it took 18 months. Pennsylvania has a little bit of a leg up because leisure travel is rebounding already. The reason it's rebounding is because we're so close to the largest population center in the country, the Northeast in New York City, Metro New York. People definitely want to get out of Metro New York. So what they're doing is they're going to places like the Poconos and Lehigh Valley, and they're slowly working their way down into places like Lancaster, which we talked about earlier. In fact, the Pocono Mountain area is at about 62% occupancy now, and they were at a trough of 17%, like the rest of the state back in April. Now, last year at the same time, they did about 82%. So it's still way off. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and the other cities, mostly Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, are going to be a lot slower coming back, unfortunately, because they're so dependent on corporate travel, sports-related travel, and things like that.
John, how big of a problem was the additional $600 in expanded federal unemployment benefits. There was a school of thought amongst certain people that people who were laid off were making more money not to work than to work. And then when restaurants reopened, a lot of them owners said, I can't even find people to work here. How big of an issue has that been in Pennsylvania?
I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that anecdotally, we have most of the people I've talked to in our membership have said it was a challenge. And you're right, they were making more money. In Pennsylvania, if you were making $79,000, I believe is the number, or less, you were making more money on unemployment when with the bonus that was put in there. But I also talked to a lot of companies that were able to get their folks to come back. And they had a culture where the people just wanted to work, and they knew that working was the right thing to do, and they came back to work. Obviously, the $600 is gone now. So now the challenge is going to be for people finding jobs, because restaurants are not bringing back 100% of their employees today. They're not going to bring them back by the end of the year. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're not back next year.
Earlier, I asked you a question. What advice would you give to a restaurant owner who's struggling to keep their business afloat? And along those same lines, what advice would you give to a young entrepreneur whose dream has always been to open a restaurant? Would you tell them to hold off?
Yeah, this is a mixed bag, and I'll tell you why. And I just did this the other day. I had this exact question. I would say go for it. If they're inspired to be in the restaurant business, go for it. People that are in the restaurant business have it in their blood. They love service. They believe that life is service. There's no business where you can that epitomizes that, in my opinion, more than the restaurant business. Here's why I would go for it. When I ask people that are interested in restaurants and college that are studying this, what their goal is, they say the same thing I said when I was in college, to own my own restaurant. Get that about 9 times out of 10. The most important thing to do when you come out of school is to go work for somebody else, and preferably go work for a big chain where you can learn good standard operating procedures. And as I used to like to say, make your mistakes with other people's money. Go get that training. And then by the time you're ready to open your restaurant, and this is the sad part, Doc, there's going to be a lot less independent restaurants out there. There's going to be a lot of restaurants available for purchase or lease, and there's going to be a lot less competition. That's the sad part. The good news is the person coming out of school will have a great opportunity, and people, as I said earlier, will always go out to eat, because they go out to eat to create memories. Think of the most important memories in your life, and probably a lot of yours revolve around sports, but for most people, they revolve around some experience in a restaurant.
Well, food and sports, right? They go together. John, let me switch gears here for 1 second with you, because this is another big issue in Pennsylvania, and it's poker machines and gambling. What is the association's stance on potentially legalizing poker machines in bars and restaurants across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, VGTs, or video gaming terminals, have been a big issue for a long time. And it's been in the legislature in some form or fashion under consideration to legalize them for as long as I've been in this job, which is now 6 years. And we have, and I will say that the lion's share of our members do not have a huge burning desire to get into the business. So we're certainly not opposed to it. It's not something we put a lot of legislative capital behind, because we have so many other priorities that are more important, like right now, getting restaurants reopened again safely at reasonable standards. So we're not opposed to it. And if we're asked if we would support a bill to bring them in, if it helps some of our members, it's great. But I guess I would say there's not what I would describe as a hue and cry among the majority of our members to get this done. To a lot of people, it's important, and for that reason, we would certainly support it. It's just not something we're putting a lot of emphasis behind right now. I also think, by the way, it is an uphill battle to get it passed. It's been an uphill battle for a long time. Right. So I don't think the likelihood of getting it there is great. And I'm afraid that once it gets there, people are going to be disappointed. I remember when we put in games of chance a few years ago. I was in the restaurant business. I was running Quaker Steak and Lube then, as you pointed out. And my chief operating officer wanted to put those in our units. When we looked at the the red tape that was attached to applying for that. I said, there's no way we can do this. There are so many landmines in this documentation here. They had predicted they would have like 3,000 put into place. I think they got 100. So I think it's one of those things that you say, oh boy, this is a lifesaver. It's a lifesaver. When it gets there, it's not quite what it looked like.
Right. Well, everybody has their hands a little bit in the cookie jar, I imagine. My last question to you, John, if you could look into your crystal ball, tell us what the restaurant industry looks like a year from now.
Well, I'm typically the eternal optimist, but I'm afraid that this isn't going to be as rosy a picture. There's definitely going to be a lot less restaurants, and unfortunately, a lot of the restaurants that are going to be gone are going to be the independents, the places we love, locally owned, the ones that brought back Pittsburgh and a lot of the neighborhoods around Pittsburgh, Lawrenceville, places like that, and those are going to be the first to go. They just can't survive. They typically have a months of operating cash, maybe. They're really hand-to-mouth operators. They only make 5 to 7% profit margin. So a lot of those are going to be gone, which means it's going to be the chains that are going to survive. But there will be new people that will follow after them. It's going to take a while for banks to get comfortable financing restaurants again. But when they do, there will be some new ones following after them. I think restaurants will look different. I think there'll be a much bigger focus on outdoor dining. We were, again, back in the 1970s. I wasn't there then, but Quaker Steak and Lube was one of the first of the Western Pennsylvania companies to put in patios. You might remember they had outdoor patios because the co-founders were visionaries. Yeah. You're going to see a lot more of that in the future because no matter what happens, people are going to be thinking about, God forbid, the next pandemic. And am I more comfortable inside or outside? So I think you're going to see that. You're going to see a lot more delivery being fine-tuned, and you're going to get fine dining at home. And you're going to see, hopefully, things like drinks to go become permanent, and not drinking and driving, but getting cocktails to go.
John, I had a couple of those Quaker Steak and Lube buffet lunches, and let me tell you, it was not easy to go back to work after, 719 flavors of wings lined up in a buffet there. So, John, listen, you've been a great guest, and I really appreciate it. I know I've learned a lot just in the past 53 minutes, and I know our viewers did as well, and I really appreciate it. I am going to ask you to hang tight back in the virtual green room so we can chat for a minute when the show's over, and I want to tell my viewers what we got going on next week.
Thank you very much, Doc. Really appreciate you taking the time to cover this. It's really important to about 580,000 employees of restaurants around the state.
No doubt. Thanks again. All right. That was incredibly informative. And John is probably the best in the business. From what I've gathered, his reputation across the country is unparalleled. Next Wednesday night, you are not going to want to miss this. Next Wednesday night, Confidently Speaking with DOC welcomes Mikey Mitz Sermonero to the program. Mitz is a former organized crime associate. He's a boxer. He's a former Tough Man contestant, and he was also an addict who has turned his life around, and he'll tell you it's a struggle every day, but he is scrapping every day, and it's a success story in the making. He is a family man. He is a successful business owner, and Mikey Mitz Sermonero has some stories that will leave you with your jaw like that. You guys have been great tonight. I appreciate it, and I hope that you tune in next week.